My last segment for the day, a little bit in the realm of psychology. We've been talking about rage quitters, which I didn't have any. Oh, and I also want to say I ran into BBW Messiah, the guy that or girl that rage quit on me twice last week. I played him a couple of times over this more recent week. We just had some good matches. Did not rage quit a single time. Didn't like gave me the rematch and everything. So I have to assume that BBW Messiah saw the podcast, felt the shame, and has corrected and fixed their evil ways of rage quitting. But as we talk about it, it's fun, and I think it's entertaining because it hits a certain foundational chord that runs through us that we all sort of interact with and are aware of, but maybe don't massage to the top and articulate and understand. And I thought maybe doing a little bit of that would be fun because it's simultaneously, like I say, kind of amusing to talk about, funny, but we all also have that kind of frustration, and that understanding of kind of why you would do it to begin with. So I want to talk about the psychology of rage quitting and why we do it. And there's an early distinction that I want to make between if there is a penalty for doing so or not. Because if there's no penalty, a la when, I mean, most of fighting game history and such, we're really starting to regulate the process now because we're playing online so much. But even at the beginning of Street Fighter V, there was no penalty for rage quitting, and so it's easy enough to understand. People do this all the time. If a criminal that is going to steal or take or step on somebody else in an unfair manner in order to make a short-term gain for themselves, someone just doesn't want to lose points. They want to climb the hierarchy, and they can do so very rapidly by simply pulling the plug every time they're going to lose. It makes sense as to why they would do that. Open and shut case, we get it. But what happens when all of a sudden there is a penalty where you lose the maximum amount of points, and maybe you are put into a purgatory group where you only get to play with fellow rage quitters or those that also don't play well with others, and like it really doesn't benefit you as far as climbing up the hierarchy to do this, and yet some people still do it. And I want to try to figure out why. And so I've looked into this a little bit, and at the core of it, like what has to happen for someone to quit out in that kind of a setting? And I think the broad answer is you're running an experiment, and the experiment in this match is you are seeing what one player's skill does against another player's skill. And if the experiment goes so far awry that it's no longer determining what you sat down to determine, then it becomes moot. And then you can start to get to a place where you go, well, we're not doing what we were going to do. Let's just pull the plug. We're not going to do it anymore. And people invest so much of their identity, especially those of us that are competitive and those of us that do this and spend a lot of time developing our skills in this. We invest a lot of our identity and a lot of our, I'd say, self-worth. How many times have you had a really bad ranked session and you come away and the rest of your life feels crappy for a little while? Like that haunts you. You're like, I'm just like, I lost LP, and so I'm less of the man that I was when I started today. Like,
Yep.
and it sounds kind of goofy, but like we laugh because it's like, yeah, no, there's some truth to that.
I have to add the story in because I played a lot of casual play. I've lost a ton of points, picking up rows, but now I'm starting to gain them back and stuff because I played Minot for 3 years, and going in with one of the more technical characters in the game who plays very differently than most others, I knew and I told people from the get-go I was going to lose a ton of points with rows, and I have, and it's fine, but I'm starting to gain them back now,
Mm.
so I'm happier. But the amount of people I see in casual mode, like very clearly fearing for their points, it's substantial. Like it's like, yeah, like it's so funny to me that in fighting games, like no one played for points back in the day. Street Fighter 2, like they kept track of your points, like the old school
Mhm.
arcade thing, like who got the high score in like Qbert or Frogger or Pac-Man and stuff. That was a big deal. Well, fighting games threw that all out the window. Is all about beating out the other guy, right? But now points are back with a vengeance because now
Yeah.
like points mean everything. And it's like if your LP is smaller than mine, well, it's too bad. So anyway,
It's this
but it's
big
really
LP
funny.
measuring contest.
It is definitely, but I mean, I've played a lot of casual just to, it's my mind is not, when I play ranked, I play very seriously. When I play casual, I'm experimenting. I'm trying a bunch of different things. I'm there to have a good time. And like, the kids might be crazy in the background. So I'm like AFK for 30 seconds or whatever, but ranked I take very seriously because of points, so it's very funny. So I point loss is a huge thing for most
Mhm.
players, man. We really equate points with how good we are.
Absolutely.
To a degree we should not, really we should not do, but we
It's
do.
easy to fall into going too far there, and I think that all of us, as we sit down and if we care about this kind of stuff, whether it's we're sitting down to play with the group of online, all of online base and all the people that we're going to run into there, or if it's in the personal, local group where you're sitting down with like the literal in-person other members of your society, you begin to understand that there's a hierarchy of player skill. You find out where you belong on that hierarchy, and there is that expectation that the higher level players will defeat the lower level players. And we tend to have an inflated view of ourselves with this kind of a thing, which can be helpful, right? Because that confidence that comes with that helps you to push forward, break through barriers. It helps in the way of growth. But like you said, if you get too far into that and you get too far of an expectation for yourself, an inflated view of yourself, it can very quickly become unhelpful. And there's so I did a little bit of a psychological or psychology research and came up with a few terms here. Illusory superiority.
Illusory superiority.
That is a condition of cognitive bias wherein a person essentially overestimates their own abilities in relation to the rest of the group. And I think that it's pretty easy to see why we would do that. It's beneficial for us, yada yada, but you go too far, And there's another very similar kind of ballpark thing here, and this is not a conclusive or exhaustive, understanding of these terms, but this is how they apply to what we're talking about here. The Dunning-Kruger effect is very similar, but it's that people with relatively low ability can often see themselves as better than they are, and in relation to like the stronger players. And I take myself back to Evo 2010, watching Daigo and Ricky Ortiz play in the grand finals of Street Fighter 4. I watched that and I saw Daigo doing a bunch of option select uppercuts, and I didn't know what those were at the time. So I saw that and I'm like, Daigo's just doing random uppercuts, and sure, they're working out, but that's a scrubby tactic. That's not going to work long term. I could do that, and I think I could have an approach that's better than Daigo Umehara's, who's up here winning his second Evo in a row. My understanding of the game and the nuances of what was going on was so broad and basic that I didn't even realize what Daigo was doing. So, and naturally, I'm like, I'm just as good as him. He's doing dumb stuff, but it's just because of my ignorance. So I think that's something of an example of the Dunning-Kruger effect.
The Dunning-Kruger effect.
So
it's amazing when you and I have both had this where you're like, I'm as good as X player, kind of thing, and you run across that player in tournament, or you get to play them. And I mean, I'm assuming you've played some of the the highest end players out there, like at their peak performance and stuff. At some points in time, you've gotten in there, and you see how good they are, and you see like all the stuff that you get away with. They know like how to deal with it, and you're like, oh, you son of a gun! Like no one's ever blown. I played Punk a couple times, and I was doing some stuff with Manat that only Dream King ever had countered, and the only reason Dream King had countered it was because we played a billion times, and he knew that there's like a 1 frame gap in here that he could blow up, and literally Punk was the only player on the planet who blew my setup up because it was a frame. There was a 1 frame gap in there, and somehow Punk knew it. And you know how crazy freaking Manat's fear advantage disadvantage stuff is. Like there's very small gaps in there, but it's like, pro players are real freaking good. I'll just say that when you get to the best of the best, like they are really, really, really good. So, there it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So now when you have this idea of how good you are and where you are in the hierarchy, relatively speaking, and it might be a little bit inflated, so that's kind of dangerous. You have this expectation. And then if something else comes along at the same time that contradicts that, something like, I beat this player. Like if I play this player, I will beat them because I am better than them. And then you play them and you lose. And now in front of you, you've got, well, I beat this player and I just lost to this player. Those can't be there at the same time. That's called cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance.
And you have to let the air out of the tires of one of those two things because they're conflicting and they can't be true at the same time. So you could say, well, it's because I'm not really as good as I thought, or I didn't have my anti-airs on lock, or I didn't play correctly. I'm not that great and I need to grow. Or it could be well, they're using scrubby tactics that are only going to work in the short term, or it was the lag, or it was the imbalance in their character's ability versus mine. And those things do factor into this whole idea of running the experiment and seeing where skill is actually determining the end result. But with how charged this all is, when you lose, you're frustrated, you're angry, you're scared, all these negative emotions, and it's very easy to just clamor for, well, how do I take this and deflect it onto other things? It's very easy to fall into this, well, it was the lag, well, it was the this or the that, and to blame it on other things. Problem with that is you don't really grow. But when you see these things, it's very easy to blame this other stuff. And if you do, well, we go right back to, if the results of the test are too heavily skewed, you can throw the whole thing out. So hey, if there's too much lag, we're not really playing a test of skill anymore. Yoink it, because we're and then I don't have to deal with actually losing, even though you kind of still do, and you still lose the points and everything. But you wanna be as far away from that truth that you're running from, that the other player is actually beating you, as possible. And that isn't to say that the lag and the character imbalance are not factors. If you find that they are, you talk about them, you write stories about them, you discuss them, you put it on social media in a way where you ask the developers to, hey, the game needs to be updated because this part of it, the net code or the imbalance in characters, is taking away from the validity of the skill-based, competition that we're sitting here to do. But when you go in knowing that you're playing online, knowing that certain characters are better, it's like a signing of a contract. You need to finish what you start. You don't have to do the rematch, and you don't have to play the game, but you do need to finish out your matches, because another way of thinking about it is, if everybody treated it in this negative way where you rage quit like what you're doing, or if enough people did it enough times, it would completely dismantle the whole thing. The whole idea of playing on ranked would become moot, and you're essentially taking a sledgehammer to the foundations of this thing that we all ultimately want, even if we want it to be ultimately better than it is right now. So, you get yourself to this place where you say, what we're doing is no longer valid, and then therefore I can pull the plug. And I think that's ultimately what people have to do in order to rage quit and actually bring that to fruition. But also, don't do it.
Makes sense to me.
All right. And that's all I had to say.